I invite you this morning to turn in your Bibles to the book of Daniel chapter 9. A little change this morning. The text I'm using is the NIV. So I normally use English Standard Version, but I looked at several different translations because this is a very difficult passage. And I was trying to find one that when you can walk out of here today that you can say, oh, okay, I get this. Instead of, what did he say? And you still may say that today. Who knows? It's a passage that's challenged many folks. I've read a lot of commentaries over the last couple of weeks. I've read a lot of different sermons from other pastors on this to try to get some way to wrap my arms around this a little bit. And I'm grateful for a big resource I used is a guy named David Dykes. And I have used his outline for this today. That's what you see in the handout in the bulletin. I know some have looked at this morning and says, what is this? Well, I hope by 12:30 when we finish here today that you will have a little bit of a handle on it. So it'd be good if you have Scripture in one hand, the outline in the other as we work through this today. The passage today we're looking at pinpoints, and let me just say this. There are all kinds of different views concerning the end times. You have pre-tribs, pre-tribulation, prehistorical tribulation. You have amillennialism. You have post-millennialism. That's hard to say, millennialism. I'm going to be like what my uncle, who was a pastor, told me, a pan-millennialist. Everything's going to pan out okay in the end. But the passage we're looking at today pinpoints the exact moment in history when the Jewish Messiah is going to present himself to the Jewish people. And what this prophecy that's given to Daniel, what we're looking at today, was given to him about 500 years before it actually happened. You know, some people are always trying to compare Christianity with other religions. Let me just say this today. Christianity is not a religion. It's a personal relationship with God. That's what Christianity is. None of the other major religious writings like the Quran or the writings of Confucius or Buddha have prophetic predictions that can be reliably verified in history. They contain stories, they contain teachings and principles, but the Bible is the only book that contains prophecy that can be verified. So Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9, as we look at it today, is neither a vision or a dream. There are no strange symbols in this passage today, no symbols of animals or statues. It is a direct message to the prophet from God delivered by the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel was sent to the prophet Daniel to give him a very clear look into the future in answer to a prayer of the prophet. Daniel was on his knees in prayer. Remember, we looked at that a couple of weeks ago. He was praying. He was pouring his heart out to God. He was confessing not only his sins, but the sins of his people, the people of Israel. And he was asking God to do something, to intervene, for God to do something for the people. So he's in prayer, confession and petition. And then look what, in verse 23, what Gabriel says to Daniel. As soon as you began to pray, an answer was given, which I, that's Gabriel, have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the message and understand the vision. Now, Gabriel says to Daniel, this vision, this prophecy can be understood. And so in verse 24, Gabriel outlines what is called 6 phases of total redemption. 6 phases of total redemption. There are 6 big things God is going to do. If you're following along with me in whatever version you're using, I think you will be able to see these. Let's look at verse 24. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to, number 1, finish transgression. Number 2, to put an end to sin. Number 3, to atone for wickedness. Number 4, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Number 5, to seal up vision and prophecy. And number 6, to anoint the most holy. Now, God is revealing His plan for Israel. This is not to the church. This is to the people of Israel. God reveals His plans for Israel, and you see there those 6 major phases of God's redemptive plan. As you look at this closely, we see this. It includes what Jesus did on the cross for us. He put an end to sin, and He atoned for wickedness. That was His purpose for being crucified. It also refers to the total scope of God's plan in the future. When during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, righteousness will cover all the earth, and when all visions and prophecies will be sealed up, finished. And God is giving Daniel a glimpse into the future that takes us up to the very end of the world as we know it. Of all the problems we have in this world, and there are a lot of problems in this world, the 2 most basic problems are simply this: sin and death. Everything else fades in comparison. It doesn't matter who we are or where we live or what we do, sin and death has to be dealt with. And this is the purpose of God's redemptive plan, to deal with those 2 things, sin and death, to solve those problems. Now in verses 25 and 26, God's timing is explained. All right, how many are still with me? All right, that's better than I thought I was. No. God's timing is explained here. Look at verse 24, and we pick up the first phrase. Verse 24 says 77s, and if you have King James Version, that is translated weeks, 77 weeks. 77s are decreed. 70 weeks are decreed. And that word means measured or divided. And we see in verse 25, know and understand this. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. All right, we're going to be looking at some time frames here. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. I want you to notice that is a precise starting point for the prophecy Daniel's being given. It's not just some nebulous thing out here. He is saying this, from what I'm going to share with you, this is the starting point. We all have a starting point on something. So this is the starting point. He says, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 70s, 7 sevens, and 62 7. It is the next word. And then that word, following that, we could put the little word in there, Jerusalem. He's talking about Jerusalem here. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, that's a stopping point. He gave us a starting point. Now he's giving us a stopping point. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be cut off. Now that's a word used that talks about a tree that's chopped down. The Anointed One will be cut off and will have nothing. Remember the scene, the crucifixion? Jesus, he died alone. There was no one. He had been betrayed. He had been abandoned. He died alone for the sins of the world. He said, the Anointed One will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come, that's the Antichrist, will destroy the city, which is Jerusalem, and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Now then, who is confused? All right, good. Let me try to explain it. Hundreds of commentaries have been written on this, and the vast majority of conservative Bible scholars agree on these points that I'm going to share with you now. The first 77s equals 490 years. We're looking at some time frames here. The Hebrew word in the King James, like I said a while ago, translates week, which simply means 7. Now it can mean 7 minutes, 7 days, 7 decades, but the context here makes it clear it is the 7 years. The same way it's used in Genesis 29 when Jacob was working a week, which was 7 years for his wife Rachel. That's the context. It's like our English word dozen. Now, if I would say to you, I'm standing here this morning, and I would say to you, bring me a dozen. A dozen what? A dozen eggs? A dozen tacos? A dozen baseballs? But if I was standing in front of a donut counter, and I said, give me a dozen, they would know what I want. I would get the donuts. The context makes it clear. The context of Daniel 9 makes it clear that he's talking about 490 years. Now hang on to that number because it's an important one here in just a little bit. Remember, I said a while ago, we arrived at a starting date for the 490 years. And Gabriel says to start when the decree goes forth to rebuild and restore Jerusalem, which we know from Scripture and from history that was in 444 BC when King Artaxerxes gave Nehemiah the decree to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and to restore the city. So with these two numbers, 490 total years and 444 BC, let's look at what Gabriel says would happen and when it will happen. Now, as we look at this, if we know much about world history, we begin to, this is history to us. This is stuff that has already happened. Daniel doesn't have a clue how, this is in the future. He won't even see all of this take place. But the Bible and history tells us that the Jews did return to Jerusalem, led by Ezra and Nehemiah. And by the year 395 BC, Jerusalem was restored just as Gabriel predicted. And remember, he said it would happen when? In times of trouble. If you remember, when Nehemiah and them were back there rebuilding the wall, they worked with their tools in one hand and a sword in the other. Because there was conflict, there were people trying to keep the city from being rebuilt again. So it was times of trouble for them. And when Jerusalem is rebuilt, this begins what many call the 400 years of silence between the end of the Old Testament and the coming of Jesus. So we see that for the first time period of 49 years, it's fulfilled. Gabriel introduces the next time period. Those 7 sevens, 49 years, Jerusalem was rebuilt. Now, when you combine the 49 years, I said that this morning, Bert Tingle, I wish you were preaching this today because you're the math guy. You know, I got out of high school math with a C if I was lucky. But when you combine the 49 years, that first period, and the 62 sevens, so 434 years, we're looking at a period of 483 years in which some very amazing events were predicted. But you compare the 490 years to the 483 years, how many years does that leave? 7. All right? Now, this is another period, 7-year period. And that last 7-year period is a time that's going to be explained in verse 27. It's the 7-year tribulation described over in the book of Revelation. But what did Gabriel say would happen at the end of the 483-year period? Verse 26, after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off. 2 big events are going to occur. The Jewish Messiah is going to be rejected and killed, cut off, and we'll have nothing. You see, for a Jewish king who was going to be killed without leaving any apparent heir, that was the idea of that happening was unthinkable, but that was the prediction. There was a former Orthodox Jewish man named Harold Sevener who became a Christian by studying Daniel 9, and he wrote this: only one person in all of Jewish history, or for that matter, in all of world history, could have fulfilled this prophecy in every detail. And that person was Yeshua of Nazareth. Daniel is told, and we can calculate exactly when the Messiah, whom God promised to send to Israel, would be cut off. During this period, there's a second major event that's going to take place. Jerusalem is destroyed. That happened. We know when that happened in history. That was in 70 AD. When Daniel received this message, Jerusalem had not been rebuilt. And Gabriel here is predicting the Messiah is cut off, that some people will come and destroy the city and the sanctuary, and it says it would come like a flood. And we know that this happened in 70 AD. The Roman army surrounded the city, and the end came with the flood. Josephus, a Jewish historian, was an eyewitness, and he wrote about what happened. Starvation and famine stalked the streets of Jerusalem. People died by the hundreds, and bodies were stacked up like cordwood out in the streets. Mothers ate their own children in order to survive. The Roman army burned the temple, melting the gold and the silver, so it ran down between the cracks of the stones. And in order to get at that precious metal, they pried the stones apart and fulfilled the Lord's prediction that not one stone would be left standing upon another. Let me just read briefly for you Luke 19, verses 41 through 44. I think it's printed on your outline there. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." They didn't recognize the time, and they really had no excuse for not knowing the time, because it was contained in their scriptures that had been written. Jesus was saying to them, "You have had time spelled out for you for 500 years. Why don't you recognize it?" And by the way, whenever the end times come here, there will be some people who will probably be saying, "Well, I didn't know." And God will say then, "You've had my scriptures for all of these years, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet you didn't recognize it." I've given you some times, some dates, some events, what happened. Jerusalem was rebuilt, a time period of what was going to be happening until the end of the Old Testament, that 400 years of silence. And that's sort of an historical foundation. But let's kind of try to understand what Daniel is trying to say in our current context, and see where we are in relationship to Daniel 9. And as we come to verse 27, this is oftentimes overwhelming and confusion. And to try to make it a little bit plainer to you on your outline, I have given you 3 clocks. You see those? 3 clocks. Well, they're really sort of like stopwatches. I think that will help us see when God's prophetic clock starts and stops. In the past, the clock started 444 BC, stopped 33 AD, and that's Israel's clock. This was a prophecy. Who was it for? What did I point out a while ago? Who was it for? It was for the people of Israel. It was for them. This is not the church. This is for the people of Israel. God told Daniel exactly the timing of these events. He tells them when to start counting, when Artaxerxes gave the command to return and to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, if you're sitting there trying to do some math on all of this, let me remind you, they were not using the Gregorian calendar that we use today. They were using the Jewish calendar, which there's some difference in how they count days and years and some of those things. But we also know from Scripture in Matthew 2, we read about the wise men from the east, right? "We 3 kings of Orient are." By the way, the Bible doesn't say it was 3. It was probably a large entourage. A large entourage of people, of magi. And if you've been with us in the book of Daniel, Daniel used that word magi at least, I think, about 14 times in this book. And so these magi were most likely from Persia, where Daniel was when he got this prophecies. And these guys likely read this passage, and they were able to understand the timing. And so they were going to travel to Jerusalem to see the anointed one that was prophesied in what we know as Daniel chapter 9. And so with that in mind, if these Persian guys could figure this out and make that journey, we may ask the question, why don't more people read the Scriptures and believe that Jesus is real and what has been said in Scripture is real about Jesus? Well, Jesus performed many miracles in his day, and some of the people who saw his miracles crucified him. And there are some people who've already decided against Jesus. There may be some of you in this room who've decided, you know what, I'm going to like my life just like it is, and I'll just take whatever comes. Some people say, my mind's made up. Don't confuse me with the facts here. But here's something that's not only is a remarkable prediction about Jesus coming, but remember the prediction about Jerusalem being destroyed was exactly as fulfilled. And listen, you got a stopwatch in your hand, okay? And when the nation of Israel rejected Jesus, it was as if their prophetic clock stopped. And it's not going to start ticking again until it's time for the final 7 years to begin. Israel's clock has stopped. Meanwhile, the clock is stopped until the church is complete. So God's countdown for Israel, 490 years, is on hold. You ever watch the space launches? Remember the rockets were sitting on the launching pad, and they got the big countdown clock that you could see on television. Then you hear the voice of the control center say, it's T-minus 4 minutes, and we're on hold. This is what's happening to Israel now. They're on hold. Those rockets, they would stop the countdown to fix a problem. Once a problem was fixed, the countdown's going to resume. God has His prophetic countdown on hold for now. So we're living in the interval between the 69th, 7th, and the final 7. Why? Because God is a God of grace and a God of mercy, and He wants millions of people added to His family. Right now, we're living in what Jesus called over in Luke 21:24, the time of the Gentiles. God's original covenant, remember, was with the Jews. But what the nation of Israel seemed to forget is God wanted to use them to be a blessing to all of the people on earth. So God has been saving Gentiles for many years. The church clock, which is the second clock you have on your outline here and present, the church clock is like that old Timex commercial. It's taking a lick, but it keeps on ticking. The church has been persecuted and slammed. The church has been burned and it's been beaten. But I'm going to tell you something. In the present age in which we live, the church is still alive. The church is still thriving in many, many places around this world. We may say, well, I don't see much happening around here. I'm telling you, God is a global God. He's a kingdom God. And it doesn't happen just in Southern Baptist Convention. It doesn't happen just in our area, but God is doing some great things all around the world. And the church is still thriving. Our clock, the Israel clock's on hold. But you and I are blessed to be able to be living during this interval of grace. When anyone puts their faith in Jesus, they will receive God's mercy and forgiveness. But we need to understand this. The church clock will stop ticking sometimes in the future. We're still ticking. We're still moving. But at some point in time, the clock will stop. Romans 11:25 says this. Paul writes, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experiencing a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles come in. Now our clock is still ticking, but when the full number of Gentiles have come in, that's it. In a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, the Father will say to His Son, go get them. Bring them home. Go get your bride. And Jesus will come and he will gather his church, he will gather his bride, and he will take us to the Father's house for the biggest wedding party that you've ever seen. That's what Paul means when he writes over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17. He says, after that, after we've been called home, after that, we who are still alive and are left will be called up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. Then he says, therefore encourage each other with these words. And at that moment, the clock stops. At that precise moment. But the other clock that has stopped for 483 years will start ticking again. For how long? 7 years. Gabriel started talking about 490 years. 483 have been fulfilled. The final 7 years will take place in the future. And what will happen when that clock starts again? Well, during the final, you see in the last clock there, during the final 7 years, Antichrist will confirm and break a peace treaty, desecrate the temple, and be defeated when Jesus returns. Look at the middle of verse 26. God is, in Daniel 9, God is talking now about the end. Verse 26, he says, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Let's read on down. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. When he talks about he here, he's talking about the Antichrist. And on the wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. During the last 7-year period, terrible things are going to occur. That's when the prince will come. He will appear to be a man of peace. That's the Antichrist. In chapters 2 and chapter 7 of Daniel, we learned that this wicked ruler will come from the revived Roman Empire. And now obviously, the two things that must be in existence for this prophecy to be fulfilled. Here's the two things that's got to be happening for that to happen. First, there has to be a nation of Israel with Jerusalem as its capital. That happened in 1967. So that leads some people to believe this 70th 7 could begin at any moment. Now, secondly, there has to be a Jewish temple. And notice it says the Antichrist will set up this abomination on the wing of the temple. Now, we look at this, and I read all kinds of things on this, and this is what most people are doing. Saying, what? What does this mean? And for instance, let me just imagine with me for a moment that some world leader comes along. He's able to convince the Arab world to give up control of the Temple Mount so the Jews could rebuild their temple. You know what would happen to him? He'd get the Nobel Peace Prize. He'd be the man of the year on the cover of Time magazine. People would applaud him. We know what Scripture says, that this Antichrist is going to be very persuasive and very effective. But Gabriel tells us in the middle of this last 7-year period, his true nature is going to be revealed. And he'll set up something on the wing of a temple that will be abomination, which causes desolation. 2 Thessalonians 2:4 says, he will set up an image of himself and demand to be worshipped. Matthew 24 says to be on guard for anything like that happening. And if this sounds a little weird, a little off the wall to you, let me share with you what Billy Graham says about these last days in his book, Till Armageddon. He wrote this: While God has a plan for man's good, the devil also has a master plan. He will bring to power a counterfeit world or system that will establish a false utopia for an extremely short time. The economic and political problems of the world will seem to be solved, but after a brief rule, the whole thing will come apart, and during the reign of the Antichrist, tensions will mount, and once again the world will explode with a gigantic world war of overwhelming ferocity, involving conflict and massacre on an unparalleled scale. This massive upheaval will be the world's last war, the Battle of Armageddon. But what does that mean to us? Look at that second clock again. Right now, we're in the time of God's grace and God's mercy. I'm going to tell you, folks, if you're here listening to my voice, whether you're in this room or you're going to be watching it online, you want to make sure you're saved. So when Jesus claims his church, you're with him. You don't want to be left behind. Now, what's the good news in all of this? The good news is this: God is in control. I've said a lot of things this morning. A lot of it's probably confusing. But the final part of the prophecy is this: we win. As part of the church, as part of God's family, we win. Or better yet, we can say Jesus wins. You know, I love to read even as a kid. I love to read now. I love to read as a kid. And there was a set of books that you could get. Check out the library or the bookmobile when it came by. It was the Hardy Boys. Remember reading the Hardy Boys mysteries? Frank and Joe Hardy were always getting in trouble. They were about to fall off of a cliff, or something was about to attack them. They were always in trouble. And then I'd go to bed at night and I would read the Hardy Boy mysteries. And just as I would be getting to a good part, my mom would say, "John Edwin, it's time to turn off the light." I can't leave these guys hanging like this. How am I going to sleep not knowing what's going to happen? So you know what I'd do? I'd go to the last page, and I would find Frank and Joe sitting at the supper table eating with their family. Now, I don't know how they got out of the mess, but I know they got out of it, and everything was okay. Now, God's given us a glimpse of the last chapter of his plan. We look around at our world and we think, man, things are bad. And they're going to get worse. But as a child of God, we've read the last chapter. And we know, as his children, we're going to be sitting down with Jesus at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he's going to return and deal with all the sin and the wickedness that's plagued this planet. He will establish his kingdom. He will come and set everything right. Bottom line is, we don't know all the details, but we know when it will happen. We can be rest assured that God's plan will be victorious. Let me ask you this question as we close today. How about your heart? Is it right with God? It's the most important question you can answer. Is my heart right with God? It's good to be able to look back in our lives and know that we have made that commitment, we've made that decision, and we have the assurance that Jesus has saved us, and one day He's coming for us, and one day we will be with Him forever. And as we look back and think upon that, I think we may sing the words of this next hymn we're going to sing. We will think about, we were shackled by a heavy burden. We were 'neath a load of guilt and shame. Then the hand of Jesus touched me. And now I am no longer the same. Has Jesus touched your life? Have you given your life to Him? We invite you this morning. We're going to stand. We're going to sing that hymn. It's hymn number 505 in your hymn book.